March 17, 1943. Stalag Luft III, Lower Silesia. The frozen ground crackled beneath Feldwebel Hermann Glemnitz's boots as he made his evening inspection round through the compound. The guard towers cast long shadows across the wire, and searchlights swept methodically over rows of weathered barracks. He had walked this perimeter 1,000 times before, checking locks, counting prisoners through the windows, ensuring that every regulation was observed with German precision. But tonight something was different. Tonight, Hermann Glemnitz knew exactly what was happening beneath his feet. For 6 months, Allied prisoners had been digging 3 escape tunnels under his watch. Tom, Dick, and Harry, they called them in their sardonic British way. The engineering was extraordinary. 30 feet deep to avoid seismic detectors. Shored with bedboards stolen systematically from every barracks. Ventilated with improvised air pumps fashioned from kit bags and metal cans. Lit by electrical wire tapped from the camp's own lighting system. Hermann Glemnitz knew all of it. He had found evidence months earlier. A slight depression in the earth near Barracks 104. Fresh dirt mixed with sand in the disposal area. Small discrepancies in timber supplies. He had walked past these signs deliberately, his eyes trained forward, his expression neutral. This was not the war Hermann Glemnitz had imagined when he received his posting in 1942. At 41 years old, he was too old for the Eastern Front, too experienced to waste in the Wehrmacht's frantic expansion. The Luftwaffe needed guards for their growing network of prisoner camps, men who could maintain order without brutality, who understood that these captured flyers were fellow airmen, not monsters. The morning he arrived at Stalag Luft III, Commandant Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindner Wilda had been explicit in his instructions. These men, von Lindner said, gesturing toward the compound where 2,000 Allied airmen lived behind wire, are officers. They will be treated as such. No beatings. No starvation. No cruelty. We are Luftwaffe, not SS. Remember that. Hermann Glemnitz remembered. He remembered because von Lindner's words echoed something deeper in his conscience, something that had been quietly screaming since Kristallnacht, since the stories from Poland began filtering back, since his own nephew disappeared into the machinery of the SS and returned speaking in a voice that belonged to someone else. The war had fractured Hermann's understanding of duty. He had served in the First World War, had believed in discipline and honor and the sacred obligation of following orders. But this war was different. This war made following orders feel like drowning. So he had made a decision, sometime in the winter of 1942, a decision he never spoke aloud and barely acknowledged to himself. He would do his job. He would maintain order. He would follow regulations. But when the moment came, when the choice was between seeing and not seeing, he would look away. The compound was a small city behind wire. 24,000 square meters of sandy earth divided into sections. North Compound held most of the American airmen. East Compound housed British officers. Each section contained identical barracks raised on concrete stumps to prevent tunneling, surrounded by double barbed wire fences with a warning wire 10 feet inside. Crossed that warning wire and guards in the towers were authorized to shoot without challenge. The prisoners lived in a strange state of suspended animation. They received Red Cross parcels. They organized theater productions and concerts. They studied languages and prepared for university degrees through correspondence courses. They played volleyball and built libraries and argued about literature and politics with the intensity of men who had nothing but time. But they also planned escape with obsessive determination. Every captured flyer arriving at Stalag Luft III had sworn an oath to escape if possible, to tie up German resources, to force the enemy to divert troops and equipment away from combat. Escape was their duty. And Hermann Glemnitz's duty was to prevent it. The mathematics of that contradiction kept him awake some nights. Squadron leader Roger Bushell, the British officer who ran the escape organization from Barracks 104, was brilliant and relentless. Hermann had studied the man carefully during inspections, noting the intelligence in his sharp eyes, the way he commanded respect from other prisoners, the barely concealed contempt when German officers passed by. Bushell had escaped before, had been recaptured near the Swiss border. The Gestapo had him for a time, which meant he carried scars that didn't show on his body. He limped slightly from a flying accident years before the war. When he spoke, his jaw was set in permanent determination. Hermann recognized that determination. It was the same quality he saw in Wehrmacht veterans returning from Stalingrad, men who had decided that survival required ignoring certain orders, that staying alive meant calculated disobedience. The tunnel operation was massive. Hermann learned its scope gradually, piecing together fragments of intelligence from informants, from his own observations, from whispered conversations he pretended not to hear. Over 600 prisoners were involved. Some dug. Some hauled dirt. Some built the railways that ran along the tunnel floors. Some manufactured civilian clothing from dyed uniforms. Some forged identity papers with stolen stamps and carefully practiced signatures. It was the largest escape operation in the history of prisoner warfare. And Hermann Glemnitz watched it happen. He watched because that was his job. But he also watched in a different way, with a kind of horrified admiration for the ingenuity, for the commitment, for the sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept captivity. These men were not giving up. They were fighting with the only weapons they had left: time, patience, and intelligence. The German High Command expected guards like Hermann to detect such operations immediately, to crush them with informants and surprise inspections and harsh punishment. But Hermann had learned something about control. You could maintain order through fear, or you could maintain order through a kind of bargain. Let the prisoners feel they had some small measure of dignity, some space for their plots and schemes, and they would police themselves. Push too hard, enforce every regulation with zealous cruelty, and you created chaos. So Hermann walked the line. He conducted inspections. He filed reports. He followed procedures. But when he found evidence that might lead to the tunnels, he filed it carefully in reports that would take weeks to process. When prisoners violated minor regulations, he looked away. When the monthly tunnel search was scheduled, he made sure certain areas were off limits due to structural concerns. His fellow guards noticed, of course. Some thought he was incompetent. Others thought he was lazy. A few suspected the truth but said nothing because they too were tired, because they too heard stories from the Eastern Front and Poland that made them question what orders meant anymore. Oberfeldwebel Jacob Müller, who worked the North Tower, pulled Hermann aside one evening in February 1943. They stood in the guard room, warming their hands over a small stove while wind rattled the windows. "You know about the tunnels?" Müller said quietly. Not a question. Hermann didn't respond immediately. He studied his hands, noting the cold reddened knuckles, the slight tremor that came from too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. "There are always tunnels," he said finally. "That's what prisoners do. These are different. But professional. Then they'll be caught. Or they won't." Müller was quiet for a long moment. "Von Lindiner asks me sometimes if the men are settling in. Morale is good. I tell him yes because it's true. But I wonder what settles us, you know? What keeps us from becoming like the others?" The others needed no explanation. They both knew guards in SS camps, had heard stories that made them physically ill, stories that couldn't possibly be true except they were confirmed by too many sources to dismiss. "We follow orders," Hermann said, the words tasting like ash. "We maintain discipline. We do our duty." "Yes," Müller agreed. "But whose duty? To what?" That question hung in the cold air between them, unanswerable. The prisoners had a joke they repeated in the compound. Hermann heard it through the wire during one of his patrols, spoken in English but with enough laughter that the meaning was clear. "What's the difference between a German guard and a German soldier? The guard has a better chance of surviving the war." It was funny because it was true. Hermann would likely live to see the war's end. The young men being fed into the Eastern Front would not. Every week brought news of another catastrophe. Stalingrad had fallen in February. The newspapers framed it as a heroic last stand, but Hermann read between the lines. 300,000 men gone. An entire army group vanished into snow and rubble. What was he guarding these prisoners from? What was he guarding them for? The questions had no good answers, so Hermann walked his perimeter and looked away from the things he was meant to see. The moment Hermann Glemnitz began truly looking away rather than simply being inefficient came on a rain-soaked morning in late autumn 1942, before the major tunnel operations began, when the compound was still being expanded and prisoners were arriving daily from recent air campaigns over occupied Europe. A young American pilot, fresh from capture, no more than 22 years old, stood at the warning wire in East Compound. His name was Lieutenant Robert Palmer, though Hermann would only learn this later from official records. The boy stood there in the rain, hands gripping the fence, staring out at the forest beyond the wire as if he could will himself through it. Hermann had been trained to watch for this behavior. Men at the wire in that particular stance often preceded escape attempts. Sometimes they were measuring distances. Sometimes they were experiencing the first stages of mental breakdown. The protocol was clear. Document the behavior, report it to the compound leader, place the individual under observation. But something in the way the young American stood there, rain streaming down his face, body shaking slightly with what might have been cold or might have been grief, stopped Hermann's hand from reaching for his notebook. The pilot wasn't plotting. He was mourning. Hermann stood in the shadow of Barracks 3 watching. 5 minutes passed. 10. The rain intensified. Other prisoners glanced at the American but didn't approach, recognizing that grief needed space even in captivity's crowded quarters. Finally, an older British officer emerged from the barracks and walked slowly to the fence. He stood beside the American without speaking, just stood there in the rain, and eventually the young pilot's hands released their grip on the wire. They walked back to the barracks together. Hermann wrote nothing in his log. The incident had not occurred. He had been checking other areas of the compound during that time period. That was the first deliberate erasure. Others followed. A prisoner caught past curfew, returning to his barracks after a forbidden late-night conversation. Hermann walked past, his footsteps audible, giving the man time to hide. A discrepancy in Red Cross parcel counts that suggested some were being held back for trade or hoarding. Hermann noted it, then filed the report in the wrong folder where it would take months to resurface. Evidence of civilian clothes being manufactured from dyed uniforms. Hermann saw the fabric hidden in a false panel, made eye contact with the prisoner who realized he'd been discovered, and then moved on without comment. Each incident was small. Each could be explained as oversight, as bureaucratic inefficiency, as the natural chaos of managing 2,000 prisoners with insufficient staff. But cumulatively, they formed a pattern that Hermann could not deny to himself even as he denied it to everyone else. He was choosing not to see. The transformation was not dramatic. There was no moment of revelation, no speech or conversation that changed his mind. Instead, it was erosion. Every letter from his wife describing the bombing of Berlin. Every report from the Eastern Front describing conditions that sounded like descriptions of hell. Every order that came down from command that seemed designed to punish rather than protect. The war was not what he had believed it to be. The enemy was not what he had been told. And duty, that clear and shining principle he had organized his life around, had become something murky and complex, full of contradictions that pulled him in opposite directions. Roger Bushell and his escape committee understood the guard psychology perfectly. They had studied it, categorized it, developed strategies to exploit it. Some guards could be bribed with cigarettes or chocolate from Red Cross parcels. Others could be intimidated. A few could be befriended through careful cultivation of shared interests. But there was a fourth category, rare and precious: guards who wanted to look away. The escape committee never approached Hermann Glemnitz directly. They were too smart for that. Direct approach meant exposure, meant forcing him to make an explicit choice that his conscience might reject. Instead, they created conditions where looking away became the path of least resistance. They timed certain operations for when Hermann was on duty, knowing his patrol patterns, knowing which areas he inspected carefully and which he merely glanced at. They left evidence in places where he would have to deliberately search to find it rather than stumbling across it naturally. They created plausible deniability for him, allowing him to maintain the fiction that he was simply not seeing what they didn't want him to see. It was a delicate dance, built on unspoken understanding. The tunnel operation under Barracks 104 had begun in April 1943, weeks after the compound's expansion. The entrance to Tom was concealed beneath a stove in one of the rooms. Dick's entrance was in a drain sump in a washroom. Harry ran from beneath a stove in Barracks 104's southern section. The engineering was extraordinary. 30 feet deep to bypass seismic microphones the Germans had buried around the compound. Shored with wooden bedboards stolen systematically from every barracks until prisoners were sleeping on increasingly unstable frames. Electric lighting tapped from the camp supply. Ventilation systems made from powdered milk tins and kit bag fabric. Hermann discovered the first signs in May. A slight depression in the earth near Barracks 123. When he probed with a metal rod, he felt the unmistakable give of disturbed earth rather than packed clay. The tunnel was directly below. He stood there for a long moment, rod in hand, feeling the weight of the decision. Report it now, and hundreds of hours of prisoner labor would be destroyed. Careers would be ended, perhaps his own included for failing to detect it sooner. Men would be sent to cooler, the punishment cells, possibly transferred to harsher camps. Or he could pull the rod free, smooth the slight depression with his boot and walk away. Hermann chose the second option. But as he walked away, a British officer named Squadron Leader Bill Williams emerged from Barracks 119 and caught his eye. For one brief moment, they looked at each other. Williams knew that Hermann had found something. Hermann knew that Williams knew. And in that exchange of glances, an understanding formed without words. This would not be reported. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The operation continued through summer and into autumn. Hermann watched the prisoners' faces during morning roll call, noting the exhaustion that came from night shifts underground, the sandy dirt that occasionally appeared on uniforms despite their best efforts to clean, the suppressed excitement that rippled through the compound when progress was good. He watched and said nothing. Other guards noticed the changes in prisoner behavior, but most attributed it to boredom or camp politics. Only a few, like Oberfeldwebel Muller, seemed to understand what was happening. And they too made their choices, each man quietly deciding what he would see and what he would ignore. The German High Command had a policy about escape attempts. Every tunnel discovered was a mark against the camp administration. Too many tunnels meant questions from Berlin, investigations, possible reassignments to frontline duty. So there was institutional pressure not to find tunnels if finding them created more problems than the tunnels themselves. Hermann used that pressure as cover. When evidence appeared that he couldn't ignore entirely, he filed reports that described suspicious activity without specifics, ongoing investigation without conclusions. He created bureaucracy as camouflage, drowning actionable intelligence in paperwork that would take weeks to process and longer to act upon. The prisoners understood this and adjusted their timeline accordingly. They knew Hermann's reports bought them time, measured in days and weeks and months. Time to dig deeper, to extend further, to prepare more escape equipment. By winter 1943, Tom had reached nearly 300 feet. Dick had been suspended due to discovery risk. Harry was progressing steadily under redoubled security that kept even most prisoners in the compound unaware of its existence. Hermann knew about all three. He knew which barracks concealed the entrances. He knew roughly how far each tunnel extended. He knew the names of the key organizers. And he kept that knowledge locked away in his own mind, shared with no one, recorded nowhere. The transformation was complete. Hermann Glemnitz was no longer simply an inefficient guard or a bureaucrat drowning in paperwork. He had become an active participant in the escape attempt, providing cover through his deliberate blindness, enabling the operation through his refusal to see what was directly in front of him. He tried not to think about what would happen if Berlin discovered the scope of his negligence. The word treason flickered through his mind sometimes late at night, when sleep wouldn't come and the wind howled over the barracks. But he pushed it away. This wasn't treason. This was just a guard doing a mediocre job. This was just a man tired from overwork, missing signs that better men might catch. The lie was thin enough to see through. But Hermann wrapped himself in it anyway. January 1944 brought cold that cut through clothing and made the ground ring like iron when struck. The prisoners in Stalag Luft III shivered through morning roll calls, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air, their faces reddened by wind that swept across the compound from the Polish plains beyond. Inside the tunnels, the temperature was more stable but no less brutal. Men worked in spaces barely wide enough for a human body, lying on their stomachs in darkness, pushing railway carts full of sandy dirt backward down narrow tracks toward the entrance chambers. The air was thick and stale despite the ventilation systems. Each shift underground left men gasping, coated in sand that worked its way into every crevice of clothing and skin. Hermann watched the prisoners emerge from barracks looking exhausted, and knew they'd been underground again. The signs were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Sand under fingernails despite careful washing, a particular kind of pallor that came from hours in darkness, the way certain men stretched their backs and shoulders after being cramped in confined spaces. He saw it all. He recorded none of it. The tunnel operation had reached a critical phase. Harry had extended past the wire, past the warning zone, approaching the forest line. The prisoners calculated they needed approximately 335 feet of tunnel to reach the shelter of trees. They had reached 348 feet by early March. The escape committee set the date, March 24, 1944. The moon would be dark. Spring weather had begun to break winter's grip, meaning frozen ground wouldn't complicate the final breakout. 200 men had been selected for the attempt, ranked by various criteria including likelihood of successful evasion, language skills and contributions to the tunnel's construction. Hermann knew the attempt was imminent. The signs were everywhere for anyone trained to read them. Increased security from the prisoner's own organization. More careful concealment of tunnel dirt. A subtle increase in tension during roll calls. The way certain men glanced toward Barracks 104 with barely concealed anticipation. And something else, something harder to quantify, the feeling in the compound had changed. The Americans and British and Canadians and Australians all walked differently now, carried themselves with a kind of desperate hope that made Hermann's chest tighten every time he saw it. They thought they were going to make it. They thought their months of labor would succeed. They thought they would slip through the wire and disappear into the night and make their way home. Hermann knew better. He knew how well organized the German internal security apparatus was, how thoroughly they monitored transportation networks, how quickly they could mobilize resources to hunt escaped prisoners. He knew the statistics. Fewer than 1 in 10 escape attempts from prisoner camps succeeded in getting prisoners back to Allied lines. And those were small-scale escapes, 1 or 2 men at a time. 200 men attempting to vanish simultaneously into occupied Poland in March 1944? The mathematics of that were brutal. But he said nothing. He filed his reports. He walked his perimeter. He looked away. The night of March 24th was bitterly cold despite spring's approach. Hermann was assigned to North Tower, which gave him a clear view of the compound. He stood in the darkness, rifle slung over his shoulder, watching searchlights sweep across the barracks in their endless mechanical rotation. At approximately 10:30 p.m. the escape began. Hermann didn't see the first men emerge from the tunnel exit. The hole was beyond the fence line, concealed in shadows under trees. But he saw the subtle signs of activity around Barracks 104. Lights being carefully controlled. Shadows moving between buildings with purpose rather than the random drift of men going to latrines. He could have called it in. One sentence on the phone to the guard captain would have brought searchlights and armed teams and the whole operation would collapse before it truly began. Hermann checked his watch. He noted the time in his log, 10:30 p.m. routine patrol, no unusual activity observed. Then he turned his attention to a different section of the compound, away from Barracks 104. The looking away had become literal now. Physical. A turning of the head and eyes from what he knew was happening. The escape ran through the night. Hermann stayed in his tower, filing routine reports at proper intervals, describing a quiet evening, prisoners settling in for sleep, nothing unusual in the compound. He became a ghost in his own post, present but unseeing, a witness who recorded nothing. Around 5 a.m. something went wrong. Hermann never learned exactly what happened. Perhaps the tunnel exit was discovered by a guard on patrol. Perhaps one of the escaping prisoners made a noise or was spotted in the forest. But suddenly the alarm was raised. Searchlights flooded the compound. Armed guards poured from barracks. Dogs barked and strained at leashes. The entire camp erupted into chaos as the full scope of the escape became apparent. Hermann stood in his tower, watching, and felt something break inside him. The careful fiction he had maintained for months shattered against reality. There would be investigations. There would be questions. There would be consequences. And indeed there were. 76 prisoners escaped through the tunnel that night before discovery. Most were recaptured within hours or days. The German response was massive and immediate. Roadblocks on every major route, railway stations monitored, military and police forces mobilized across occupied Poland and Germany. Hermann was not present for the initial recaptures. He remained in the tower, then at the guard post, filing report after report as order was slowly restored to the compound. But later he learned what happened to the men who ran. Of the 76 who escaped, only 3 made it back to Allied territory, 2 Norwegians who reached Sweden and 1 Dutchman who made it to Gibraltar. The rest were caught. And 50 of those captured were murdered. The order came from Hitler himself, passed down through chains of command to Gestapo officers who selected prisoners not randomly but deliberately, choosing those they deemed most dangerous, most likely to cause trouble if returned to camps. Squadron leader Roger Bushel, the mastermind of the operation, was shot on a roadside near Saarbrücken. Squadron leader James Cadenac, flying officer Robert Stewart, flight lieutenant Romas Marcinkus, on and on, the list of names read like a roll call of courage and determination, and every single one ended in a bullet. The Germans called it shot while attempting to escape. The truth was execution. Murder. War crime. Hermann Glemnitz was summoned to the camp commander's office on March 27, 3 days after the escape. Von Lindner sat behind his desk looking like a man who had aged 10 years and 72 hours. His uniform was immaculate as always, but his face was gray, his eyes hollow. "Tell me what you saw," von Lindner said without preamble. Hermann stood at attention, hands behind his back, and made his report. He had seen nothing unusual. He had filed his routine logs. He had conducted his assigned patrols. No signs of unusual activity had been observed during his shifts. Von Lindner listened without interruption. When Hermann finished, the commander sat silent for a long moment, studying the younger man's face with eyes that had seen too much. "Do you understand?" von Lindner said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "that 50 men are dead? 50 Allied officers shot like dogs on roadsides and in forests because they dared to do what any soldier would do, what we would do if captured." Hermann said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Do you understand that this camp will be investigated? That every guard, every officer, every civilian worker will be questioned about how this happened under our watch?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that if it's discovered that guards knew and did nothing, they will face charges? That careers will end? That men will be sent to the Eastern Front?" "Yes, sir." Von Lindner stood and walked to the window, looking out at the compound where prisoners moved like ghosts between barracks, their routines continuing even as news of the murders spread through whispered conversations and coded messages. "I am being removed from command," the commander said to the window. "Transferred. My career is over. Not because I allowed the escape, escapes are expected. But because Berlin believes I was too soft, too willing to treat these men as human beings rather than property." He turned back to Hermann. "They're looking for scapegoats. They will find them. I suggest you be very careful in what you remember and what you report." It was not permission to continue lying. It was simply acknowledgement of reality. Hermann was questioned 3 times over the following weeks. Each time he repeated the same story: routine duties, standard procedures, no unusual observations. The investigators, SS officers with cold eyes and meticulous notes, pressed him on details, tried to find contradictions, implied that failure to detect such a massive operation suggested incompetence or complicity. But Hermann's story held because it was internally consistent and because proving deliberate blindness is nearly impossible when the person being questioned admits to having seen nothing. Incompetence is not a crime, especially in wartime Germany where resources were stretched and quality was declining across every sector. He was not charged. He was not transferred. He remained at Stalag Luft III, now under new command, under stricter supervision, walking perimeters that felt different now, heavier, stained with blood that had not been spilled on this ground but elsewhere, on roadsides in Germany and Poland where 50 men had died for daring to escape. The prisoners knew about the murders within days. The news arrived through coded messages and letters, through prisoners transferred from other camps who had heard details, through the simple absence of men who should have been returned but were not. The compound fell into a silence heavy with rage and grief. Hermann saw how the prisoners looked at German guards now. The careful neutrality had been replaced with contempt mixed with fear. They understood, all of them, that the rules had changed. Escape was no longer a game of cat and mouse with defined parameters. It had become Russian roulette where capture meant probable death. And Hermann understood something too, something that made his deliberate looking away feel not like mercy but like complicity. By enabling the escape, by allowing the operation to proceed when he could have stopped it, he had contributed to the deaths of 50 men. The mathematics were inescapable. If he had reported the tunnel in May when he first discovered evidence, the operation would have been crushed before reaching completion. The prisoners would have been punished, sent to cooler, perhaps transferred to stricter camps, but they would have been alive. The escape attempt would never have happened. The recaptures would never have occurred. The executions would never have been ordered. Hermann Glemnitz looking away had killed 50 Allied officers as surely as if he had pulled the triggers himself. That knowledge settled into him like lead, heavy and permanent and slowly poisoning everything it touched. The last months of the war were chaos. By early 1945, Stalag Luft III lay in the path of the Soviet advance from the east. In late January, with artillery fire audible in the distance, the Germans evacuated the camp, marching 10,000 Allied prisoners westward through snow in what would become known as the Long March or the Death March, depending on who told the story. Hermann Glemnitz marched with them. He was not given a choice. Guards were needed to maintain order, to prevent prisoners from escaping into the Soviet lines, to ensure the columns kept moving despite cold and exhaustion and dwindling food supplies. For 6 days they walked. Prisoners collapsed from exhaustion and were left behind, assumed dead, though many were picked up by advancing Soviet forces or Polish civilians. Guards collapsed too, falling from formation, disappearing into snow. The columns fragmented and reformed, merged with other prisoner groups fleeing westward, became a stream of humanity trying to stay ahead of the war's final convulsions. Hermann walked beside men he had guarded for 3 years, and the relationship between guard and prisoner had become something strange and undefined. They were no longer enemies in the clear sense. They were simply people caught in the same disaster trying to survive. On the 4th day, a British officer named Flight Lieutenant David Williams collapsed near the front of Hermann's column. The man's face was gray, his breathing labored, his feet wrapped in rags because his boots had disintegrated days earlier. Other prisoners helped him stand, but it was clear he couldn't continue. The protocol was simple. Prisoners who couldn't march were left behind with a guard contingent. But Hermann knew what that meant now. The men left behind would be shot. The guards would claim they died from exhaustion or that they attempted escape. Berlin's orders were explicit. No prisoners were to fall into Soviet hands. Hermann made a decision. He moved to the collapsed officer, examined him briefly, then stood and addressed the other prisoners. "This man can continue," Hermann announced in his rough English. "He just needs assistance." 2 Australian flight lieutenants stepped forward without being asked, supporting Williams between them. The column moved on. That night, Williams found Hermann at the edge of the makeshift camp they'd established in a barn. The British officer's face was haggard, but his eyes were clear. "You didn't have to do that," Williams said quietly. Hermann didn't respond immediately. He was smoking a cigarette, one of his last, staring at stars visible through gaps in the barn's roof. "No," he agreed finally. "I didn't." "Why did you?" "Because I've seen enough men die." Williams was quiet for a moment. "We know you know. About the tunnels. About what you didn't report." Hermann felt ice in his chest despite the barn's warmth. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes you do. And we know about the 50. About what happened to the men who made it out." "Then you know my looking away killed them." "No." Williams's voice was firm. "Hitler killed them. The Gestapo killed them. You just gave them a chance." "A chance at what?" "At dying on a roadside instead of in a camp. At trying. At refusing to accept captivity. At doing what every soldier swears to do." They stood in silence, 2 men on opposite sides of a war that was ending, finding themselves in a conversation neither had anticipated having. "It haunts you," Williams said eventually. "Not a question." "Yes. It should. That's how you know you're still human." The column reached western Germany in early February. The prisoners were dispersed to various camps, most to Marlag und Millag Nord near Bremen. Hermann was reassigned to a processing center, then later to administrative duties as Germany's defensive perimeter contracted and more personnel were redirected to combat roles. He was there, in an office in Hamburg, filing endless reports about prisoner transfers and supply requisitions, when the war ended in May 1945. The British Army found him 2 weeks later. He was arrested as a POW camp guard, though his specific role meant he wasn't classified as high priority for war crimes investigation. He spent 14 months in a British detention facility, was questioned extensively about his service at Stalag Luft III, and eventually released without charges in June 1946. Hermann returned to a Germany that no longer existed. His wife had died in the bombing of Berlin in 1945. His nephew, the one who had joined the SS, never returned from the Eastern Front. The house he'd owned in Hamburg was rubble. He found work as a clerk in the British Occupation Administration, filing papers, translating documents, doing the quiet bureaucratic work that helped rebuild a shattered country. He never spoke about his war service except when directly asked, and then only in the barest terms. He had been a guard at a Luftwaffe prisoner camp, had done his assigned duties, had been present for the Great Escape. He never mentioned the looking away. In 1948 he received a letter. It had been mailed from England, passed through multiple screening processes, forwarded through Red Cross channels until it found him. The return address was from a town called Ipswich. Hermann opened it with shaking hands. The letter was from squadron leader David Williams, the officer he had helped during the death march. Williams wrote about his return to England, his attempts to rebuild a life interrupted by war, his work helping other veterans adjust to civilian existence. And then in the letter's final paragraph, "I wanted you to know that several of us remember. We remember what you didn't see when you should have seen it. We remember that you looked away when looking was your duty. We remember that you saved lives during the march even when you had orders to do otherwise. You are not responsible for the 50 who died. They died because evil men gave evil orders. You are responsible for the hundreds who lived because you showed them basic human decency when you didn't have to." Hermann kept that letter in his desk drawer until the day he died. The legacy of Hermann Glemnitz looking away is complicated and cannot be reduced to simple moral calculation. The 50 men executed after the Great Escape died because of Hitler's order, because of Gestapo brutality, because of a regime that made murder into policy. But they also died because an escape attempt succeeded that Hermann could have stopped. Would those 50 men have chosen differently if they had known the consequences? Would they have decided that a chance at freedom was worth the risk of execution? That question has no answer because they weren't given the choice. They acted based on incomplete information, believing the rules of war would protect them if captured. Hermann's looking away gave them the opportunity to try. It did not protect them from the consequences of that trying. In the decades after the war, as histories were written and survivors published memoirs and researchers pieced together exactly what happened in prisoner camps across Germany and occupied territories, Hermann Glemnitz appeared in footnotes. He was mentioned as one of the guards at Stalag Luft III, sometimes described as incompetent, occasionally praised as one of the decent ones, never fully examined as a man caught in an impossible moral maze with no clear path out. The prisoners who survived remembered him differently than official records suggested. They remembered a guard who conducted inspections with visible reluctance, who seemed to always be looking the wrong direction at critical moments, who enforced regulations with the minimum necessary force, who, during the death march, made decisions that saved lives when he could have made decisions that ended them. Hermann never sought recognition for his actions. He never joined veterans organizations or attended reunions. When British researchers contacted him in the 1960s for a history of prisoner camps, he declined to be interviewed beyond confirming basic facts about his service. "I was a guard," he told one persistent researcher. "I did my job poorly. That's not interesting." But it was interesting. It remains interesting. Because Hermann Glemnitz's story illuminates a truth about war that gets lost in histories focused on battles and heroes and clear moral lines. That most people in war are not heroes or villains but simply people trying to navigate impossible situations where every choice carries weight and consequences. Hermann died in 1973 in Hamburg. His funeral was small. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, had no children, few close friends. The obituary in the local paper was 3 sentences long, noting his birth date, his service in 2 world wars, and his post-war work in municipal administration. No one mentioned Stalag Luft III. No one mentioned the tunnels he didn't discover or the escape he didn't prevent or the 50 men whose deaths haunted him for the rest of his life. But in England, when David Williams read the obituary notice forwarded by a contact in Germany, he sat at his desk and wrote a letter to the editor of the Hamburg newspaper. The letter described Hermann Glemnitz as a guard who maintained his humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it, who looked away when seeing would have caused harm, who carried the weight of impossible choices without seeking absolution or recognition. The newspaper never published the letter. But Williams kept a copy, filed it carefully with other papers from his war service, where it remained until his own death decades later. The story of guards who looked away is not unique to Hermann Glemnitz. Across the war, in camps and prisons and occupation zones, individual guards made individual choices about what they would see and what they would ignore. Some did it for money, accepting bribes to turn blind eyes. Some did it from laziness or incompetence. A few did it from conscience, from the recognition that following orders was not the same as doing right. Hermann Glemnitz belonged to that last category, though he would never have claimed moral superiority for it. He simply recognized that the war had made monsters out of his country's leadership, and that maintaining humanity meant choosing carefully which orders to follow and which to subvert through the simple act of not seeing what he was meant to see. The 50 Allied officers executed after the Great Escape are remembered today. Their names are inscribed on memorials. Their stories are told in books and films and documentaries. They died trying to do their duty as soldiers, to escape and return to combat, to tie up enemy resources through their evasion attempts. Hermann Glemnitz is not remembered except by the few who studied the guard structure of Stalag Luft III carefully enough to notice his name recurring in accounts from multiple prisoners, always with the same curious detail. He never seemed to see quite what he should have seen. That selective blindness was both a mercy and a curse. It enabled escape attempts that might have saved lives by tying up German resources and maintaining prisoner morale. It also enabled the circumstances that led to execution murders that violated every principle of warfare humanity had tried to establish through centuries of conflict. Hermann lived with that ambiguity until his final day. He never resolved the question of whether his looking away had been right or wrong. He simply knew that he had done what his conscience demanded in circumstances where every choice was wrong in some way, where duty and decency pulled in opposite directions, where following orders meant participating in evil and disobeying orders meant accepting consequences he was not brave enough to face. The legacy of his looking away lies not in grand historical narratives but in small moments. A letter from a British officer thanking him for saving a life during the death march, a mention in a memoir describing him as one of the good ones, the fact that he was never charged with war crimes despite serving in a position where such charges were common, the memory, preserved in aging veterans' minds, of a German guard who seemed to understand that prisoners were people, that war had rules. Even when those rules were being violated, that maintaining humanity sometimes meant deliberately failing at your assigned duties. When the wind blows across the site where Stalag Luft III once stood, now farmland and forest in Poland, nothing remains of the tunnels dug so desperately, the barracks where men waited for freedom, the guard towers where Hermann Glemnitz stood and deliberately looked away. But the memory persists. Not in monuments or memorials, but in the complicated truth that war creates impossible moral situations, and that sometimes the most human thing a person can do is fail at what they're ordered to accomplish, look away when they're meant to see, and carry the weight of that choice in silence for the rest of their lives. Hermann Glemnitz looked away. And in that looking away he preserved his humanity even as he failed his duty, enabled escape even as he contributed to capture, saved lives even as he helped create circumstances that ended them. That is not a simple story. It is not a comfortable story. But it is a true story, as true as any story can be when telling the history of people caught between orders and conscience, duty and decency, the right thing and the possible thing. He looked away on purpose. And the echoes of that purposeful blindness ripple through the years, asking questions that have no satisfying answers, demanding we acknowledge complexity in circumstances where we would prefer clarity, insisting we remember that most people in war are neither heroes nor villains but simply people trying to remain human in conditions designed to strip humanity away. That is the legacy. That is what remains. A German guard in a Polish camp in 1943, turning his head deliberately away from evidence he should have seen, and living with the consequences of that turning away until the day he died.